Long before anyone put a shovel into that stretch of ground, the ranch had already been whispering that something below it did not belong on any ordinary map. The signs were never dramatic at first. They rarely are in places like this. A patch of soil that compacted differently under weight. Survey lines that refused to stay consistent from one pass to the next. Instruments that behaved normally across most of the property, then faltered for reasons no one could fully pin down in a narrow zone that seemed, on the surface, unremarkable. Even the animals at times appeared to notice what the eye could not. Certain areas were crossed quickly, avoided without pattern, as if some part of the landscape carried a pressure not listed in any report. For years, Skinwalker Ranch had built its reputation on that kind of pattern, fragments rather than declarations, disturbances that seemed too small to matter until they began to repeat. That is what made the place so difficult to dismiss, and just as difficult to define. Every serious investigation into the ranch eventually runs into the same problem. The data refuses to stay inside a single category. Geological explanations may account for one event, but not the next. Mechanical failures can be blamed on bad luck, right up until they begin arriving in clusters. Witness testimony can be set aside as memory or suggestion, until an instrument records something unnervingly close to the same story. Kaleb Bench had spent enough time in that environment to understand the difference between noise and pattern. He was not the sort of investigator who needed mystery to feel important. If anything, his value to the team came from restraint. He watched carefully. He documented what he could. He understood that, on this property, the strongest case was usually built not on a single startling moment, but on the accumulation of small inconsistencies that refused to disappear. That reputation mattered, especially to those who had grown tired of exaggerated claims surrounding the ranch. Kaleb's approach suggested something steadier. If he became interested in a location, it was usually because something measurable had drawn him there. And in the weeks leading up to the breakthrough, something had. A series of readings had begun to suggest that one section of the ranch was not matching the underground assumptions the team had been working with. The discrepancy was not theatrical. It was structural. Survey data hinted at a subsurface feature that did not align cleanly with prior interpretations of the terrain. The ground seemed to carry an internal logic at odds with the map above it. That alone would have justified another look. But on Skinwalker Ranch, a mismatch between expectation and terrain carries extra weight. It raises an old possibility the team has faced again and again. That the ranch is not simply producing unexplained events on its surface, but may be organized around hidden spaces beneath it. So when attention turned toward that area, it did so quietly. No one needed to announce a revelation. The site was approached the same way careful investigators approach all potentially misleading clues. Slowly, methodically, and with the understanding that the ground can make fools of confident people. Excavation and survey work moved forward in measured steps. Dirt came away. Stone was examined. The team followed the kind of procedural rhythm that often looks uneventful from the outside, until one detail interrupts it. On that day, the interruption came not as a collapse, but as a change in resistance. The material in front of them had been behaving one way, then suddenly another. What should have felt consistent did not. A section yielded differently. Behind what seemed like ordinary blockage was the suggestion of void space. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Not a loose pocket of disturbed soil. Not the random break one might expect from uneven geology. Something more coherent than that. The kind of emptiness that implies form. No one celebrated. That is important. In places where people are eager for proof, excitement can arrive too early and distort everything that follows. But the reaction here was more telling than excitement would have been. The mood narrowed. Movement slowed. Voices lowered. The team understood, almost immediately, that whatever sat beyond that barrier did not fit neatly into the ordinary explanations already available to them. As the obstruction gave way, the opening behind it seemed to absorb the light rather than simply receive it. Flashlights reached in first, thin beams searching for shape, edge, continuity. Dust hung in the air. The silence that followed was not dramatic silence, not the kind added for effect. It was the brief stillness of trained people adjusting to an unexpected fact. The hidden section was real. It had dimension, and it extended beyond the assumptions that had brought them there. That first moment mattered because it changed the investigation from theory to encounter. Up to then, they had only suspected that the underground picture was incomplete. Now the incompleteness had a visible boundary. A passage or chamber, perhaps part natural, perhaps modified, perhaps something harder to classify, had been sitting beyond reach, sealed away from casual view. The question was no longer whether the ground was concealing something. The question had become far more difficult. What exactly had it been concealing? In the immediate aftermath of the breach, the team did what disciplined teams do when surprise threatens to overtake judgment. They stepped back into process. The opening was assessed for stability. Airflow was considered. Structural risk mattered underground, in a way few viewers fully appreciate. A hidden space does not need to be mysterious to be dangerous. One unstable shelf of earth, one shift in pressure, one unseen weakness in the surrounding material, and the story changes instantly. That practical caution gave the moment credibility. They were not rushing toward an answer. They were trying to keep the question from turning into an accident. Even so, the shape of the newly exposed section began pressing on the imagination almost at once. It did not present itself as a simple cave. The lines did not feel entirely casual. Certain angles, certain boundaries, suggested order, or at least interruption. The surrounding geology carried one kind of texture. The hidden section suggested another. Whether that difference came from human modification, unusual natural formation, or some combination of the two was not clear. But the uncertainty itself was revealing. On a ranch where so many mysteries begin as interpretation, this one began as form. And form has consequences. Because once a structure appears underground, where none was expected, every older anomaly nearby starts to rearrange itself around that new fact. Equipment glitches are no longer just glitches. Odd surface readings are no longer isolated. Historical rumors, long treated as folklore, exaggeration, or incomplete memory, suddenly gain something dangerous: context. That is why the instruments came next. If the hidden section meant anything beyond surprise, it needed to show itself in data. Readings were taken near the breach and compared, implicitly or directly, to the patterns the ranch had produced before. This was where the story could easily have collapsed into disappointment. Many strange discoveries become ordinary the moment measurements begin. But here, the measurements only complicated the picture. Devices that should have returned clean consistency, instead, produced irregularities difficult to ignore. Electromagnetic behavior near the opening did not settle neatly into expectation. Thermal differences seemed sharper than the visible environment alone could explain. In a less burdened location, such anomalies might still have been written off. as the combined effect of mineral content, buried metallic debris, moisture variation, or simple equipment sensitivity. And some of those possibilities had to be considered. Serious investigation requires that they be considered. But the tension arose because the anomalies were not appearing in an informational vacuum. They were surfacing in one of the most heavily scrutinized pieces of land in modern paranormal investigation, a place already associated with repeated episodes of signal disruption, sensor irregularity, and environmental behavior that seems to shift under observation. That resemblance did not prove connection, but it invited it. What if the hidden section was not just another buried oddity? What if it was tied to the broader pattern the ranch had been showing for years? What if the interference that frustrated so many prior experiments was not merely atmospheric, but architectural, connected in some way to spaces below the surface that had not yet been fully mapped or understood? Once that possibility entered the room, the tunnel became more than a find. It became a candidate explanation, or at least a new organizing clue. And still, the structure itself kept asking for attention. As more of its visible characteristics were studied, the hidden section continued to resist easy classification. If it was natural, it was a strangely suggestive expression of nature. If it was man-made, it raised immediate questions about age, purpose, and concealment. The shape appeared too deliberate in some places, too ambiguous in others. Surfaces hinted at weathering, but weathering alone says little without clear reference. The space carried the impression of having endured time, yet not of having surrendered its identity to time. That distinction is subtle, but important. Old things often become vague. This did not feel vague. It felt withheld. The possibility of human involvement opened an entirely different line of thought. Who had made use of such a space, if anyone had? Why was it absent from the understanding investigators thought they had of the area? If it had once been known, why had that knowledge thinned into rumor, fragments, and omission? Deliberate concealment is a powerful idea, and not because it confirms the extraordinary. It is powerful because it suggests intent. Intent means choice. Someone, at some point, may have decided that this section of underground space was better left out of view. On Skinwalker Ranch, that suggestion lands with unusual force because the property already exists under the long shadow of story. Indigenous oral traditions, second-hand ranch accounts, former owner recollections, and years of media attention have created an archive of claims that ranges from deeply compelling to impossible to verify. Hidden pathways and underground chambers have appeared in those stories before, sometimes clearly, sometimes only as implication. Most were impossible to pin down. They lived in that uneasy territory between repeated rumor and usable evidence. But discoveries like this change the emotional status of old stories. Once even one buried feature is confirmed, memory begins to feel less abstract. That does not mean every rumor becomes true. It means the cost of dismissing them rises. For decades, people connected to the ranch have described the place as layered, not merely in the physical sense, but in the way events seem to stack on top of one another without resolving. Lights in the sky, loss of time, animal disturbances, mechanical failures, sudden physiological unease. None of these automatically lead underground. But when a hidden tunnel section appears beneath a property already saturated with unresolved testimony, the underground stops being a backdrop. It becomes part of the argument. You can imagine what that realization does to a team standing at the edge of a breach. The human response, in fact, may be one of the clearest pieces of evidence in the entire sequence. Not evidence of what the tunnel is, but of how seriously it was taken by people accustomed to uncertainty. Kaleb and the others were not strangers to the ranch's reputation. They had seen investigations swell toward excitement before, only to flatten under scrutiny. That history tends to discipline a person. It teaches caution, and yet caution, here, did not look like dismissal. It looked like respect. There was tension in that respect. Not fear in the theatrical sense, but the more intimate strain that comes from recognizing that a discovery might matter before one knows how. Excitement was present, of course. Any investigator would feel it. But it was threaded through with something heavier, an awareness that significant finds on this property rarely arrive alone. They tend to pull consequences behind them. So decisions had to be made carefully. How deep could the team safely probe? What methods would preserve both evidence and stability? Which explanations needed to be tested first, before speculation got ahead of observation? These are not glamorous questions, but they are the questions that separate a credible inquiry from a dramatic performance. And on this ranch, credibility is always under pressure. That pressure only increased as the possibility of deeper extension emerged. Because the breach did not feel self-contained. Hidden passages seldom do. The mind instinctively wants to know not only what has been found, but where it leads. Was this section part of a larger network? A sealed branch? A dead end protecting something smaller? Could it connect to known anomalies elsewhere on the property? Zones of repeated interference? Places where observations have clustered for years? Locations where the ranch seems to react most intensely to intrusion? Those questions may sound speculative, but they follow a practical logic. If repeated anomalies have spatial anchors, then underground architecture, natural or artificial, may help explain why certain coordinates on the ranch behave differently from others. Perhaps the tunnel was a remnant of human use that accidentally intersected a geologically unusual zone. Perhaps it was constructed because someone before them had recognized something meaningful in that exact location. Or perhaps the structure represented neither accident nor understanding, but an old attempt to access, contain, or navigate whatever forces seem intermittently active there. And yet, for all those possibilities, the team was dealing with hard limits. Passages may be blocked. The surrounding material may be unstable. Equipment that performs flawlessly elsewhere may become unreliable at exactly the moment clarity is most needed. That has happened often enough on the ranch to be more than a footnote. Investigation here is repeatedly constrained by the strange coincidence that the most important moments are also the ones most likely to suffer interruption. Then came the moment implied in the title, the point at which the breach stopped being merely a discovery and became a turning point. What followed the breakthrough was not a triumphant unveiling, but a development that changed the emotional temperature of the site almost immediately. Whether it came in the form of a sudden reading, a behavior shift in the equipment, a response from the environment, or some human reaction difficult to account for in ordinary terms, it carried one unmistakable effect. The hidden section no longer felt passive. That distinction matters. A buried structure can be mysterious simply because it exists. But when an unexpected event follows its exposure, mystery sharpens into relationship. The team was no longer dealing only with what had been hidden. They were now forced to consider what the act of uncovering it had set into motion. Maybe it was a surge where no surge should have been. Maybe a device behaved in a way too abrupt to dismiss as routine drift. Maybe the atmosphere of the site altered, not in a cinematic way, but in the subtle, difficult language investigators often use when trying not to overstate something they nonetheless felt. However it presented itself, the sequence was enough to shift the trajectory of the investigation. The tunnel had gone from object to catalyst, and once that happens, every response becomes more careful. The team's immediate posture would have reflected that change. Findings need to be preserved, but investigators need to remain interpreters, not believers. The ranch has punished certainty before, so the event, whatever form it took, would have been handled with the same difficult balance that defines the best work ever done on the property. Record it, compare it, question it, and resist the temptation to force it into a conclusion simply because the pattern feels emotionally persuasive. Still, some moments alter research priorities, whether anyone wants them to or not. A hidden tunnel section, exposed after years of subtle hints, followed by an unforeseen development at the site, is not the kind of discovery one simply files away. It changes the shape of the next question. It demands follow-up. It asks investigators to reconsider what parts of the ranch deserve renewed attention, and whether the underground has been undervalued not only as setting, but as mechanism. That broader implication may be the most important part of the story. For years, Skinwalker Ranch has stood at the intersection of competing explanations. To some, it is a landscape of misunderstood geology and self-reinforcing legend. To others, it is a rare concentration point for genuinely anomalous phenomena. And between those positions lies the much harder possibility that the ranch is both more ordinary and more strange than either side wants to admit. That physical structures, historical residue, environmental variables, and unclassified experiences may all be entangled in ways that resist the simple categories people bring to them. The tunnel discovery fits that possibility almost too well. It can be read as geology, history, concealment, accident, folklore, or threshold. Each interpretation captures part of the event. None fully closes it. That is precisely why it matters. Because mystery, in its most honest form, is not the absence of explanation. It is the presence of several explanations, each incomplete. So what might this hidden section ultimately mean? It may prove to be a forgotten human feature whose significance was magnified by the ranch's reputation. It may reveal a practical history of the land that was partially lost and only later draped in paranormal significance. Or it may become one more piece of a much larger pattern, suggesting that the ranch's strangest episodes are not random at all, but clustered around buried structures, hidden boundaries, or points of access no one yet fully understands. What can be said, with care, is simpler than any theory and more durable than most conclusions. Something was there. It was not expected. It altered the assumptions around it, and once exposed, it seemed to invite, not answers exactly, but a deeper class of questions. That may be the truest legacy of discoveries like this. They do not end the mystery. They teach you where the mystery has been waiting. On Skinwalker Ranch, that is no small thing. In a place where evidence so often arrives as atmosphere, suggestion, and scattered interruption, a hidden structure beneath the ground carries unusual weight. It gives form to suspicion. It offers edges where before there were only stories. But it also reminds us that form alone is never enough. What matters is how that form interacts with the wider behavior of the place, with the history layered over it, and with the investigators disciplined enough to keep asking what they do not yet know. And perhaps that is why the image lingers. Not because a tunnel was found, but because it was found there, under that ground, in a landscape already crowded with unanswered events. A wall gives way. Light enters a space no one had fully seen. Instruments begin to struggle. Old rumors seem to straighten their backs. A team that has learned to distrust easy revelations grows quieter instead of louder. That is the feeling worth holding on to, and it leaves one final thought difficult to shake. Some places hide their history because time covers them. Others seem to hide it because the land itself resists being read in a straightforward way. Skinwalker Ranch has always inspired both reactions at once. It offers traces, then withholds context. It invites investigation, then complicates the act of looking. The tunnel now joins that long pattern, not as proof of every claim ever made about the property, and not as a neat answer to the ranch's reputation, but as a sober reminder that the ground beneath a mystery can be just as unsettled as the stories above it. Not certainty, not spectacle, just the unsettling possibility that beneath one of the most studied mysteries in America, another layer has been waiting in silence, patient, sealed, and only now beginning to answer back.